Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking at something that, well, it goes way beyond a simple policy shift. We're exploring the fallout from maybe the single biggest structural change in global governance since, what, the end of World War II?
That's right. We're talking about the deliberate unraveling of Pax Americana.
And it all kicked off on January 7th, 2026.
It did. It started with a presidential memorandum that initiated the U.S. withdrawal from a truly staggering number of international organizations. We're talking 66 of them.
66. I mean, that number alone is just, it's critical.
It is 35 non-UN entities and another 31 UN bodies.
Because it tells you this wasn't some kind of, targeted pruning. This was scorched earth.
A total reset. And the most visible casualties were really the pillars of global cooperation. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the IPCC on climate science, and of course the World Health Organization.
Right. For 80 years, the U.S. was basically the chief architect of this whole system, the indispensable nation, as they used to say.
And now the blueprint's been torn up. The anchor's gone.
So our mission today is to really get to grips with the fallout from that. What does this massive geopolitical void mean for stability? And more specifically, what does it demand of NATO, an alliance that was, fundamentally built on the idea that the U.S. would guarantee that stability?
A huge question.
So let's start with the why, the rationale, because this wasn't just about saving a few bucks. This was deeply ideological, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Trump administration's view, and this is coming straight from the analysis in the Global Review, was blunt. They characterized these institutions as, and I'm quoting here, redundant in their scope, mismanaged, unnecessary, wasteful, poorly run.
The whole laundry list.
The whole list. And this is the key part, captured by the interests of actors advancing their own agendas contrary to our own. So it's a mix of inefficiency and, well, deep mistrust.
But then the State Department added another layer to it.
Right, yeah.
A more political framing.
They did. They framed it as resistance to what they call DEI mandates, gender equity campaigns, and climate orthodoxy.
So what they're really saying is that these organizations have gone beyond their original purpose.
Exactly. That's the argument, that these global bodies are now trying to constrain American sovereignty through, what they see as political correctness or unnecessary regulation. The very act of pooling sovereignty became the threat.
And for NATO, the consequence isn't theoretical, it's immediate. It's what analysts are calling the security multilateralism gap. What exactly is that?
It's a great term. So NATO security depends a lot on stability in places on its periphery, the Middle East, North Africa, the Sahel,
Yeah.
When the U.S. pulls its leadership and its funding from the civilian agencies, the soft power groups that manage refugee flows or distribute aid, that stability just evaporates. And then NATO, which is a hard power military alliance, has to step in and manage the crisis that follows.
So to put it simply, if the U.S. stops funding a UN refugee camp in Jordan, NATO doesn't just, note it and move on.
No.
NATO eventually have to deploy ships and border forces to handle the mass migration that happens when that whole system collapses. That's the gap in action.
Precisely. You're turning civilian problems into military burdens, and that's something NATO was just never designed to do long term.
Okay, so let's talk about the vacuum. The U.S. was the system guarantor. Now it's leaving 66 seats empty. Somebody has to step in.
And global politics hates a vacuum. That leadership void is the single most dangerous consequence, and China and Russia are perfectly positioned to exploit it. China especially has a very systematic strategy for this.
How are they doing that? I mean, beyond just writing a bigger check.
It's about writing the rules. The source material points to China's intent to fill funding and leadership gaps in places like UNESCO and the International Law Commission.
The ones that set the standards.
Exactly. By taking control, Beijing gets to redefine international standards for things like emerging tech, for human rights, and crucially, for maritime law. It allows them to push their authoritarian model. One expert said this just leaves a door wide open for Chinese dominance of the UN system.
So they're not just providing money, they're getting the power to write the global regulations that everyone else, including American allies, will have to follow.
That's the game.
And what does this do for those more ambiguous threats, the gray zone stuff?
It creates some very specific blind spots. The U.S. exit from the European Center of Excellence for countering hybrid threats, for example, directly weakens NATO's ability to coordinate.
And gray zone warfare, just for our listeners, that's things like disinformation, cyber attacks, political coercion.
All the stuff that happens just below the threshold of an actual military attack.
Right.
So without the U.S. sharing its operational data and its leadership at that center, NATO allies are just going to be slower and less effective at spotting and responding to, say, a coordinated Russian influence campaign.
And what about the money? The UN is saying the U.S. owes about $1.5 billion. Is that really the main issue, or is it this Article 19 vote threat?
That's the inflection point. The U.S. has been in arrears before, that's not new, but this withdrawal makes it an intentional structural default. And the UN is clear. These are legal obligations, not optional donations. So that $1.5 billion in arrears risks the U.S. losing its vote in the General Assembly under Article 19.
And losing the vote is symbolic, sure, but it's also a signal that the U.S. is just forfeiting its seat at the very table it helped build.
It is. It completely guts the diplomatic leverage you need to rally support on key issues, whether it's sanctions on Iran or anything else. The financial mess just adds a legal vulnerability to the strategic retreat.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Looking at the real-world consequences. We've talked about the geopolitical void. Now let's look at the tangible effects, starting with climate.
Well, the U.S. withdrawal from the UNFCCC it's unprecedented. The U.S. is now the first and only nation to leave that 30-year-old agreement. It's a total stop to U.S. government engagement on climate.
And the concrete security risk for NATO allies in Europe isn't just about melting ice caps. It's about intelligence, right?
It creates a huge strategic intelligence gap. Losing U.S. scientific data and satellite contributions to the IPCC compromises the ability of allied planners to predict climate-driven conflicts. The IPCC isn't just reports. It's the granular data on water stress and crop failures that defense ministries use to forecast instability.
So without U.S. data, European planners are kind of flying blind on potential resource wars in the Sahel or new territorial disputes in the Arctic.
And that feeds directly into the crisis on the southern flank. We know 2024 was the hottest year on record. Without U.S. leadership, the risk of climate-driven displacement just accelerates. That means more mass migration pressure on Europe's borders.
Okay, let's pivot to global health, the withdrawal from the World Health Organization.
This one is frightening. It removes the main global mechanism for pandemic surveillance and early warning. So when the next novel pathogen shows up, that centralized hub for coordination and data sharing, it's just gone.
And for NATO states, the risk then?
It just skyrockets. Yeah. If civilian health systems start to collapse during an outbreak because there's no international coordination, the source material suggests it could require these massive, high-cost, military-led humanitarian responses from NATO forces.
Again, turning a civilian problem into a military one.
And distracting the alliance from its core defense mission.
Finally, the economy. The OECD and the global tax deal. How does that fit in?
This might be the most immediate threat to transatlantic unity. The U.S. told the OECD that its landmark global tax deal, Pillar 2, would have no force or effect in the U.S.
Pillar 2. Remind us what that is.
It's the agreement to set a global minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. It was designed to stop that race to the bottom, where countries keep lowering their tax rates to attract companies.
A race that creates tax havens.
Right. And the U.S. pulling out basically guts the entire deal.
So what's the likely response from Europe?
Retaliation. It threatens to kick off immediate trade disputes, what economists call beggar-thy-neighbor policies. You'll likely see EU members put in place retaliatory digital services taxes or other specific taxes aimed at U.S. tech giants. That starts to fragment the whole economic foundation of the alliance.
So it's clear these withdrawals, they're not just policy spats, they're breaking fundamental rules across the board.
They're systematically removing what you could call shock absorbers in fragile regions. Take the withdrawal from UNRWA, the Agency for Palestine Refugees, and the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia.
They weren't just aid groups, they were, as you say, shock absorbers. What does that mean in practice?
It means they provide basic services, health, education, that give millions of displaced people some stability. They stop a local humanitarian crisis, like a famine, from immediately spiraling into a regional war. When they're gone, desperation grows, instability grows, and you get more migration pressure directly on Europe.
But the precedent that seems to have really shaken analysts involves military action, the operation in Venezuela.
This is where the norms are just shredded. On January 3rd, 2026, a U.S. military action in Venezuela without any UN Security Council authorization or even congressional approval. Analysts called it a devastating precedent.
Because by asserting a unilateral right to intervene, the global message is
The message is that the U.S. may well have shredded what little is left of international norms, specifically the idea of non-intervention. It just hands a perfect excuse to rivals.
Yeah.
China can point to Venezuela to justify action in the South China Sea. Russia can point to it to justify, well, whatever it wants in Eastern Europe.
the rules-based system only works if the most powerful player follows the rules.
And then, to add to the murkiness, the U.S. also pulled out of the UN Register of Conventional Arms.
Which means less transparency.
A lot less. It removes the key tool for tracking weapons transfers globally. Suddenly, it's much harder for NATO intelligence to see who is selling what to whom in conflict zones. It's a huge benefit to actors who thrive in that gray zone.
This all leads to what the analysis calls the sovereignty contagion.
Exactly. The risk that this U.S. rhetoric that global agreements constrain sovereignty starts to spread. If the founder of the system treats treaties as optional, why shouldn't everyone else? And that contagion isn't just external. It weakens the internal cohesion of NATO's Article 5.
So if allies start to doubt the U.S. commitment to global rules, they might start to doubt its commitment to the security treaty itself.
You have to ask the question.
Okay, so the burden shifts. It shifts entirely to Europe. What are the big recommendations for how the allies should adapt?
The burden shifts profoundly. It shifts from relying on U.S. diplomacy and soft power to a much greater reliance on European hard power. NATO now has to compensate for capabilities it was just never designed to have on its own, like public health surveillance.
And the first recommendation is to accelerate a European defense pillar.
Yes, urgently. European members have to develop an autonomous pillar that can manage these regional crises on its own. This means real investment in independent satellite surveillance for monitoring climate and migration, creating autonomous rapid reaction forces for humanitarian missions, and building European command structures that aren't dependent on U.S. assets.
That's a huge undertaking. But what about the immediate crisis for the institutions that were just defunded?
The allies have to coordinate bridge funding. And quickly, to stop the immediate collapse of these agencies, or maybe more importantly, to prevent immediate Chinese dominance. The priorities are things like the WHO regional offices and the core functions of the IPCC.
Otherwise, you're basically ceding global governance to your rivals.
For the price of a few $1 million, yes.
And on intelligence, where that strategic gap is biggest.
Independence is everything. European intelligence services have to build their own capabilities to monitor hybrid threats and climate risks. The source recommends a big expansion of the European Space Agency for Earth observation and creating autonomous assessment capabilities to replace IPCC functions for their own security planning. They have to own their own data.
It's a profound challenge. It confirms one thing. The U.S. is no longer the guarantor of the system NATO was built to defend. We are watching the end of an 80-year era.
And this transition poses some existential questions for the alliance. Can it maintain cohesion when its most powerful member is actively undermining the very framework that justified its existence?
And can European members actually find the political will and the money to fill this void on their own?
And I think the fundamental question for you, the listener, is this. Can NATO evolve from being a military alliance that's dependent on American leadership to becoming something broader? A true security community, one that's capable of wielding its own soft power, its own economic influence, without the American blueprint?
Because the January 2026 withdrawals marked an inflection point. There's no going back.
No. The actions the allies take right now will decide whether the future is defined by a dangerous, competitive multipolarity, or if they can somehow build a more balanced but much, much more expensive multilateralism on their own.